We have just finished up the trophic cascade and predation, and now we're moving into other interactions with involving larger animals in chapter 21. This is a picture of a stream mesocosm facility to test interactions among organisms that Keith Giddo built at Konza Prairie Biological Station. And it's kind of a nifty little setup. There's a riffle and a pool in each one of these units. And you can put a block. So there can be 36 of these. And there's a pipe that goes underneath here. And there's an electric trolling motor you can see up in the corner there. And that's actually pulling water through the system and causing it to recirculate here. And then that pipe can also dump fresh water in, drip it in at a constant rate. So basically, he just made a bunch of little streams, and then they're cool because you can, if you pull the separator between like these two, you could have two pools and two riffles, or if you pulled another one, you could get a whole chain of a stream and replicate that. You know, there's 6 rows of these. So it's a nice experimental thing where you can have controls and treatments. And in this case, they're interested in the herbivorous fish species, Campossima anomalum and Foxinus erythrograster. I think that species might have changed, but I'm not sure. And they're using them in a behavioral experiment in the same mesocosm. So both how the Campossima and the Foxinus interact with each other, but also they're herbivores, but they also excrete. And it turns out they can stimulate the production of their food when they eat it. And they feed in slightly different ways. The stone rollers are raspers, and the Foxinus picks away at stuff. So you can measure things like primary production and those kinds of things, but get at all the complex interactions that these two herbivorous fishes have. Oh, yeah, it looks like Emma did take the screenshot and send it out in the chat. So if you're wanting to download that, you can do that before the lecture's done. Thanks, Emma. So we're going to speak about non-predatory interspecific interactions among plants and animals in freshwater communities. And again, we'll go through the same sort of series that we did with the microbes and talk about competition, mutualism. And then we'll talk about complex community interactions. So we're talking about direct and indirect interactions. One of the things in the history of ecology was the idea that competition was sort of this main interactive force, and maybe predation were the main forces that species had evolved to deal with. And the idea of niche separation and how two species that are competing from the same thing would eventually evolve ways to either one knock the other one out completely, or they'd separate out. And that being a primary selective pressure. And you can go all the way back to Darwin and see this kind of statement. However, in the 60s and 70s, a number of ecologists realized that oftentimes people would assume that competition was the reason for things going on in the field, and sort of ignored some of the other interactions. And that most of the times when somebody said these two species are in competition with each other, there was no real data to back that up. And one of the things that they've argued is that with evolution, that there's what you would call the ghost of competition past. And what that means, if two species have been coexisting with each other and are using similar but somewhat different resources, like we talked about the protozoans that specialize in small particles versus large particles. They're actually not in competition with each other anymore because they've evolved to specialize on one or the other. That's what would be called the ghost of competition past. So if you actually are in the field, they're not competing with each other in current times, or at least very much. But there are some good examples of competition, and we'll talk about it. The point being is that you have to be a little bit careful to assume that any particular thing's going on without testing it. Primary producers, as we've already talked about, compete for nutrients and light. And if they're benthic, they can compete for space. And space and light are kind of, and nutrients are all kind of the same thing, right? If you're too crowded, then you're not going to get light or nutrients as well. Competition can structure wetland communities, and it leads to evolutionary specialization over time. Here's an example of intraspecific competition. Intraspecific competition. And so in this case, tadpoles, Rhena tigrina, were reared at different densities. And they just put 160 per container and 5 per container. And the ones that were in the high density just weren't getting enough food, so they weren't able to grow nearly as quickly as those that were in the low density container. This has practical consequences for fish managers too. They don't want to have a fishery that they've got a lot of larval fish trying to grow up, right? They want to have a relatively balanced between not enough to make enough adults and so many that they're all stunted and not growing very big. So there's practical. So this is intraspecific competition. And then I always remind myself that international is between companies, so interspecific would be between species, and intranational would be, or is inside, intra would be the same species. Just a little trick to remember that. Another competition that can happen with animals is competition for mates. And this is again the stone rollers that we already talked about, Campostula anomalum. And the male has these very obvious fin markings and tubercles on the top as compared to the females. And these can play a part in competition for mates in terms of aggressive interactions with other males, and also not so aggressive interactions with the females. Here's an example of some competition from pond of 2 species of typha in a wetland in May at the beginning of the production year, and in September. So remember, the macrophytes grow over the year and then they go down, they grow over the year and go down. So at the beginning, they're kind of spread out. The one species, latifolia, is a little bit more on the top, and the angustifolia is a little bit more on the bottom. But by the time you get to the end of the growing season, they're really well partitioned, and the shallowest type is doing best. Latifolia is doing the best in the shallow depths, and there's a fairly sharp transition to a different species type, angustifolia. So this one perhaps is, would you say that angustifolia might be adapted to higher light or lower light? So we talked about light adaptations. Who has the low light adaptation? Angustifolia has high light adaptation or low light? Okay, Tom's going there, right? Lower light for angustifolia. Because it's deeper in the pond. You can see this thing's at, this thing's pretty far down in the pond. So 100 centimeters is a meter, right? So the ones that are half meter to meter deep, and if it's a pretty productive pond, like the willow pond that we went to, there'll be almost no light down there. So maybe this is better for low light, and the other one dries out or something like that. I'm not sure what the adaptive pressure would be at the shallow in this particular system. And here's 2 rotifers eating different algae, Caratella aeruleana and Cochlearis. And we see that one of these is focused on being able to eat and grow faster if there's a lot of food, and another of the species, if the concentration is lowest, that are collecting low concentrations. So again, we see these trade-offs, right? just like with high light adaptation and low light adaptation. Now we have high food concentration, high food availability versus low food availability. You can be a good collector and find stuff well at low concentrations, or you can grow really fast and basically eat up all the food if it's at high concentrations, depending upon which of the adaptations you've got. With rotifers, you know, they filter, so this could be one that is a stronger filterer, but if you don't have to filter so strongly, then you can put your energy into growing and doing other things. So competition has received a lot of attention in the ecological literature. Mutualism and facilitation is not so much. So facilitation doesn't necessarily have to be a mutualism. It can be a one-way interaction, commensalist, that one can have a positive effect on the other and the other can have no real effect on the first one. In general, because of the way mutualism works, it's generally approached on a case-by-case basis. The reason for this is that people that study interactions, they tend to study things that are obvious and things that are sort of related to each other. So people that are interested in competition are studying one kind of group of organisms, right? Maybe they're studying fishes or something like that, or invertebrates in a stream, and they know all about those. And you can kind of, predation is pretty obvious. So they've got to eat stuff and you can find it in their guts and you can see these interactions. Mutualisms tend to occur evolutionarily when organisms are able to provide something to another organism that's cheap for them, but expensive for the other organism. You can think about this as, you know, maybe one of the easiest ones to think about this is pollinations. Pollination, where a bird or an insect can fly around easily, so it can transport pollen from one plant to another. But it can't photosynthesize, and the plant can photosynthesize and produce sugar or some kind of high energy reward. And so it's cheap for the plant to create nectar relative to what the bird can, what the hummingbird can. And it's cheap for the hummingbird to fly from flower to flower. This kind of thing automatically means that organisms are quite different taxonomically and specialized in quite different things. So you have to have a broader view to get at some of these mutualisms than you do necessarily for some of the competitions. So there are some interesting examples. Cichlid fishes in Lake Tanganyika actually brood in multi-species groups. And they do so because some of the other cichlid species are adapted to being egg predators. And so if you have a group that is laying their eggs all in one area, even if they're multiple species, and they all gang up and chase off the bigger fish, then they can be more successful at reproducing than the ones that are trying to make it alone, right? So there's a behavioral example of protecting eggs from predators. There's similar examples where fishes in North America will at least facilitate other fishes when they build brood nests, and then the other ones, the big piles of stones and stuff, and the other species can use that to brood in as well. Yeah, the cichlids have in those African lakes have quite a bunch of cool adaptations, you know, ranging from very specialized things like eating scales of other fishes to things like this where there's actually a mutualistic relationship. I suspect as people look at it more, they'll find things like they have for birds, like mixed feeding flocks, where a group of different species of birds will go through and specialize in different areas, but they kind of scare up things for the other ones to get. So I suspect there's some of that going on as well. There's another area where groups of wetland plants facilitate each other in harsh environments. So we've talked about this a little bit already when we talked about methane release. So why is it that methane is released by wetland plants that are emergent? My question for the day, going back in time. So groups of wetland plants can facilitate each other partially through oxygenating the sediment. And they're doing that because their roots need to respire oxygenically, right? And they're pumping carbon down in there, and then they have a vascular system that allows oxygen to diffuse down into the sediment. The unintended consequence that doesn't affect the plant much is that can also allow methane to diffuse out of the wetland sediment. And so wetlands are big sources of methane. Just want to bring that back up, but the main point here is that if you have one plant in a bunch of anoxic sediment, it's not going to be able to put much oxygen down in there, right? But if you have a bunch of them, then there's going to be a lot more movement of oxygen into the sediments, and they can all facilitate each other. In addition, if you have fine sediments on the edge of a lake or something like that where there's wave action, right, it can just wash the plant away. But if you have a whole bank of roots right down underneath there of the macrophytes, they can basically hold that sediment down and not wash away. So we already talked about how on large lakes, it's hard for macrophytes to establish because of the intensity of the waves. There's this intermediate size area where if they can get enough of them established, they can hold down the sediment and not be washed away. And then if there's an example of a time when there's nitrogen limitation, nitrogen fixing species may be able to increase the amount of nitrogen in the general sediment and the water, which the non-nitrogen fixers might be able to take advantage of. Invertebrates may facilitate others in feeding relationships. And this is an example from the streams in Puerto Rico where they have shredders, shrimp, freshwater shrimps, and some are shredders and some are collector-gatherers. And the shredders are eating leaves, but they're eating the microbes on the leaves. So they need the microbes to be able to get nutrients. So if they shred up those leaves, they make them available to the shrimp, the other shrimp that's collecting little bits. But that other shrimp then processes those leaves, excretes, and stimulates the microbes on the full leaves that are falling in. So both of those are more productive when they're in the same stream at the same time than if they were there alone, one or the other. And we'll talk a little bit about cleaning mutualisms in the next slide, I believe. Oh, no, we got a couple more. So here's an example of tubophysid oligochaetes, and these are basically worms, freshwater worms, just like earthworms, but they live in fresh waters. And they're pretty common in low oxygen environments. However, apparently their movements can stimulate the growth of the other one. So this is an experiment where they're looking at the growth rate of each of the worms, Limnodrillis, Tubifex, and Peloscolex, on the y-axis. And then there's error bars on the bars, right? And then they grew them all in different combinations, either one alone or all three together or every pair of twos. So in this example, this is the Limnodrillis alone. When they grew it with Tubifex, it grew faster. And when they grew it with the Peloscolex, it grew even faster. And it appears that there's not an additive effect of those. So if they put them both in at the same time, it was no different than if the Peloscolex was there. Similar with Tubifex, except for there appears to be an interactive effect for Tubifex. So growing alone, going with the Limnodrillis, going with the Peloscolex, and then when they're both together, it has the highest growth rate. Peloscolex is kind of a loser in all this because it looks like it's not much affected by the others, right? So it's helping these guys, but it doesn't seem to be helping itself much to be in with these guys. In any case, this is an experiment that shows you can assume that these worms that apparently seem somewhat similar, from at least to us from the outside, probably not from their point of view, um, how they could potentially be mutualistic and not competitive with each other. So this is a kind of a cool one. You know, there's in coral reefs, there's those examples where there's the big fish that comes up to the reef, and the little fish or the little shrimp comes up and swims around and picks all the parasites off of it and cleans it up. And so it's a mutualism. They don't, you know, you'd think the big fish would eat the little fish or the shrimp, but they don't, because they're getting benefit out of it. And so there's an example of something that's been fairly widespread in marine habitats, but has actually been discovered as being something that can occur similarly in freshwater habitats. And so this is a crayfish that occurs in the northeastern United States, and you can see up here the whole beautiful crayfish there. But then when you look closely at the crayfish, if you see right here, they have these annelid worms, branchodelid annelid worms. And if there's a small number of these, so here's the worm. If there's a modest number of these worms, they clean off the outside of the crayfish, get rid of parasites or just junk growing on them that might slow them down, and the crayfish can grow faster. However, if the worm concentration gets really high, yes, like a pit crew, that's good. But if the concentration of the worms get really high, they start eating the crayfish itself and they slow it down. So there's this balance between it being a good thing and a bad thing for the crayfish. So it goes from being to an exploitative relationship from a mutualism experiment. But you know, again, it's cool because we have this situation where we've hypothesized that these things can occur, and then we find them in a case of similar convergent evolution in freshwaters that we see in the marine. Is there anything that limits the annelid worms to keep them in check? Well, they probably have their own. They probably have their own predators as well. Somebody asked, why do crayfish need to move fast? Well, crayfish are active hunters and gatherers. They just have to go out every night and collect a bunch of stuff. So if they get their growth drops down, that's not good. Yeah, and also to get away, they have to escape predators as well. That's good, Emma, that's great. Okay, so another mutualism. So there's lots of examples where one species has a strong effect on another and the second has little effect on the first. And we are the ultimate example. We harm many species that have little influence on us. We also help some species. So for example, sports fish. We have introduced trout in cold waters all over the world. But they have very little effect on our survival. That, you know, it's all for sports fishing, right? And there's a lot of that goes on as well. Basically, any cropland you can think of as being that way too, but a lot of freshwater things. So there's a bunch of sort of theoretical community ecology and aquatic food web questions that are out there. And the first one of those is, are more diverse systems more stable? This has been a long-standing argument. And I would stop here for a sec. Okay, so on the first question, are more diverse systems more stable? We've got a lot of people that really are weighing in that more diverse systems are more stable. And that was certainly the idea that was around when Elton first talked about this, because this is in the 50s, and he's an early community ecologist. He noted that if you try to grow crops, you really have to work hard to keep one species there, right? You have to really work. That it's not a stable system. It's really work hard to keep that stable. And then he also said, well, look, it's not in the tropics. There's not these big bursts of insects and stuff like we have in the temperate zone. And so that diversity of the tropics leads to more stability of the systems, that anytime somebody gets up, somebody else knocks them down, like an insect starts to grow and the birds eat it down. It turns out that that's not 100% true, that actually there's a lot of variation going on in diverse tropical systems, and there can be big sweeps of things. When we talked about, for example, the Chytrid disease sweeping through the tropical frog populations and just wiping them out. That is a whole lot of diversity, and it didn't stabilize it much, although maybe some of them are somewhat. In that case, actually, if there's a species that can carry it around and be a spreader but not die, that diversity is actually harming the rest of the species. There was a, Aaron is talking about increased competition for limited resources with too much diversity. So you can only put so many species into an area. And we've got that. Remember we talked about island biodiversity, island biogeography? And if you shrink down the size of a habitat, you're going to shrink down the diversity. So in that case, the system is too diverse, essentially, for the habitat that it was in. And then there's a mathematical work that Robert May did. He's a very famous ecologist who just passed away in the last year or two. And he just looked at the mathematics of stability. And if you just have a general matrix of interactions and everybody's interacting with everyone else, systems get less and less stable as they get bigger and bigger. They're more likely to fall apart. He didn't say that means that more diverse systems are less stable. He just said that there has to be some structure in the way communities interact with each other. Okay. Next question. Is biodiversity related to ecosystem function? And I think we'll pick up on this at the end. We can talk about it just a little bit, but I'm going to stop the recording.